Vivo have finally released their flagship smartphone to the global market, that being the Vivo X90 Pro. Now, while there is a Plus variant in this year's X90 lineup, it remains a China exclusive. So for now at least, the Vivo X90 Pro is the best from Vivo that you can actually get your hands on. The device has already started its global rollout, but as of right now, it's only available in Malaysia, where it starts at the exact same price its predecessor did. The X90 Pro sports the best 1-inch main camera sensor currently available, that being the massive Sony IMX989. Packs an insane 2160Hz PWM dimming into its display, houses the new TSMC-made Dimensity 9200 chipset, upgraded Vivo V2 chip, and is kitted with a new cooling system, larger battery, faster 120 watt wired charging, LPDDR5X RAM, UFS 4.0 storage, and more. Does Vivo's best offering in the international market have what it takes to compete against some of the best smartphones that 2023 has to offer? Let's find out in my full review of the Vivo X90 Pro. While the X90 Pro Plus comes in two different colors, we only get one color for the international X90 Pro, that being legendary black. The good thing is that it comes with a vegan leather-like finish. It is a new design for the X90 series. I think it looks absolutely fantastic. Many people are saying that there's too much branding on the back, but I actually think that it makes it stand out in a different, unique kind of way, and I think it looks absolutely stunning. It does pack in a larger 4,870 milliamp hour battery. It has faster 120 watt wired charging. It has 50 watt wireless charging. The latest flagship chipset from MediaTek, that being the Dimensity 9200, an ARM Immortalis G715 integrated GPU, the latest LPDDR5X RAM, extremely fast UFS 4.0 storage, a newly improved ultra-large vapor chamber cooling system, dual SIM 5G, Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.3 and NFC. And just like its predecessor, we have that IP68 dust and water resistance certification. The backplate is made from vegan leather with a nice soft touch, but very grippy when taking photos. The display protection, while unspecified, does have a new Q9 luminescent material. The frame is made from aluminum and it comes in at 9.34 millimeters of thickness and is slightly lighter than its predecessor at 214.85 grams. When it comes to cameras, we do have a 12 megapixel IMX663 ultra-wide sensor, which is a tad bit downgraded from last year's X80 Pro, a 50 megapixel IMX758 portrait telephoto sensor with 2x optical zoom, and while this telephoto sensor has been upgraded from its predecessor, the X90 Pro actually lacks a periscope sensor. But it certainly makes up for it with that massive 1-inch sensor size 50 megapixel Sony IMX989 main camera sensor, with a larger aperture than any other phone with the same sensor. And other than those three sensors, we do have a TOF laser autofocusing sensor, Zeiss T coating on all the lenses, as well as Vivo's new V2 ISP chip. We of course have that wonderful Zeiss natural color effect with the ultra wide on or off, and it looks fantastic either way. We have natural color on now with the main sensor, and off is a lot more vivid, I guess you could say, and you can do it with the telephoto as well using 2x optical zoom with it on or off. Now, taking a photo of me, you can see how much more natural I look with it on, and when it's off it is more vivid, but I feel like this is something that more people would use, so we're going to stick to that from now on. And we do have a bunch of different Zeiss style filters that you can use when you're taking photos, specifically in portrait mode, and it works best when you set to 2x optical zoom using the telephoto. But my favorite two has to be the cinematic option, which kind of gives you that cinematic field of view, as well as Cine Flare, which actually looks better at night. We'll get to that later on. And the natural bokeh portrait looks fantastic too. We can take 1x portrait shots using the main, and we can also do double exposure, which is something unique to the device. Now, there's a sports mode, so when someone's jumping around or you literally watching a football game, you can get perfect images, not to mention that macro shots come out almost near perfect. Probably the best I've ever seen using the ultra wide. Now, going from ultra wide 12 megapixels, which is its native, so no binning over here, to the main 50 megapixel main shot, which looks fantastic. Binning that down using 4:1 pixel binning looks even better thanks to AI. We do have 2x optical at 50 megapixels. We can bin that down as well at 2x optical to 12.5 megapixels. We can do 5x digital as well as 10x digital. It still looks pretty good. When we get to 30x digital, it starts to knock off a little bit, and 40x digital is actually the max zoom that we can do, though it's still kind kind of looks decent. Now we can zoom in at 4K 30 FPS from ultra wide to main to the 2x optical telephoto lens all the way up to 10x digital, and it actually does it very smoothly, and you can't really notice much of the transition between the lenses, but you know it's there, so that's good to know. Fortunately not 60 FPS, and ultra wide is capped at 30 FPS when recording at 4K, though it still does a more than fantastic job in terms of detail and color accuracy. 4K 60 FPS is the cap when it comes to the main in terms of FPS at 4K, so 60 FPS looks fantastic, a little bit smoother than 30 that we saw earlier with the ultra wide, and we do have 24 FPS when recording at 8K using the main sensor. Stabilization is disabled over here, there's no way of enabling it. It still looks pretty great, especially when you're standing still and taking a video of me over here. It gives that nice natural depth of field. Now, if you want more of a depth of field, we do have that Zeiss cinematic portrait mode, though capped at 800p, gives that cinematic field of view and it looks great. We can also do natural portrait mode, though it is capped at 1080p. You can do 30 or 24 FPS, though 24 FPS is a good standard. And we do have 1080p 240 FPS slow motion, as well as 720p 480 FPS slow motion. Not the slowest I've seen around, but it still does a fantastic job. And the quality is actually a lot better than others that I've seen, though there is a bit of a crop in factor. Now we do have 4K 60 FPS while I'm running over here with stabilization off, and you can see with stabilization off doesn't look the best. With standard stabilization on, this is pretty much the sweet spot, especially when using the main sensor. And we can do ultra stabilization, though it drops down to 1080p and 60 FPS, and we do have ultra wide horizontal line stabilization. Though it does a good job, it kind of makes the lens look a bit wonky sometimes. 4K 30 FPS ultra wide at night is nice and stable. It's not the best ultra wide night footage I've seen, but it's up there with the best of the best. And 4K 60 FPS recording using the main cam at night looks actually fantastic set to 60 FPS, considering we're taking this in a pretty dark scenario over here. Now, if we drop that down to 24 FPS, it actually reverts. You can't choose 24 FPS, you choose 30 FPS, it reverts to 24 FPS at night, but things are a lot brighter. It handles light a lot better as well. And we can use AI night video over here, and it does a great job of making things that are too dark really come to light. Now, recording 8K 24 FPS at night using the main sensor does a job as you would expect. It's actually rich, filled with detail and color, though it's a bit wonky because of stabilization. Ultra wide night mode off and night mode on makes a pretty big difference over here with the night mode because of the sensor we're using, but night mode off to night mode on using the main doesn't make a huge difference because of that great main sensor that we have, though it does control the light a lot better. Now, with 2x optical using the telephoto, it makes a huge difference with night mode enabled in terms of controlling light. Even at 5x digital zoom, looks better in terms of brightness, but it doesn't really control the light in that signage at the top very well. 10x does the same thing, and when we get to 30x, it's actually crystal clear when you're zooming into 30x, though night mode doesn't really have a good effect. Same thing with 40x, it looks good with no night mode, and with night mode on looks exactly the same. Now, unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity of using the wonderful Astro mode within the camera UI this time around on the X90 Pro because of weather conditions, but about a month ago, I took this shot on the X90 Pro Plus, the Chinese exclusive model that is, and it uses the exact same main sensor and it looks absolutely fantastic. And once again, because of the bad weather I've had recently, I've taken this from my X90 Pro Plus review and plugged it in here to show you guys how incredible the supermoon shot looks even at 1x when using the main sensor. Be sure to check out that review after this one. Now back to shots from this device. Night mode off, taking a photo of me, and night mode on, it makes a world of difference. Fantastic over here. With night mode off, taking a portrait and night mode on, doesn't make a huge difference, but the background blur is fantastic. Cine flare with night mode off looks completely different to cine flare with night mode on, which I absolutely love. And 2x portrait with night mode off and on doesn't make a huge difference, but it kind of controls the light as well as the depth a bit better, and it does a fantastic job for a telephoto sensor. The back sensors on the Vivo X90 Pro are most certainly flagship level. Look, you don't have a periscope, which is a bit of a bummer, especially since the X80 Pro of last year did have one, but at a very low megapixel count. And zooms, even digitally going up to 40 times, do a great job. The ultra-wide sensor may have taken a bit of a back seat this time around, but it more than makes up for it with that incredible IMX989 1-inch main camera sensor, which takes some of the best photos and videos I've ever seen produced from an Android flagship. On the right side of the device, we have a power button, and above that we have a non-split volume rocker. At the bottom of the phone, we have a dual SIM 5G tray. Unfortunately, there is no expandable storage, though there is a wonderful water resistant seal thanks to that IP68 certification that I told you guys a bit earlier. And we do have a USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type-C port, as well as dual stereo speakers, one at the bottom and one within the earpiece. No Dolby Atmos though, we are stuck to Vivo's Super Audio. Now we do have that wonderful professional photography at the top, and alongside that we have an IR blaster, which is a nice little touch. And at the top of the display, we have a 24mm selfie camera. It is a 32 megapixel 1 in 2.8 inch sensor size, and it takes absolutely fantastic 30 megapixel stills here, whether you do normal or portrait or use the multiple Zeiss filters that we could use earlier in the main sensors. You can use with the selfie sensor as well, which is a really nice touch if you ask me when it comes to taking selfies during the day. I love the cinematic mode option, but unfortunately no lens flare, and taking a regular selfie in a different scenario as well as portrait, once again, looks nice, crisp and clear with great edge detection. Now, of course, we can take portrait video, but it is capped at 1080p and 30 FPS, though you can choose a 24 FPS option. And we do have the Zeiss cinematic portrait mode option like we could do with the back sensors as well, which is great.
Technic here recording a 1080p 60 FPS selfie video on the brand new globally released Vivo X90 Pro. The video quality and audio quality looks pretty good, but I'm not sure if you've noticed, it is a bit shaky, and that's because stabilization mode is off by default because it crops in a hell of a lot when it's enabled. As you can see, the cropping factor, and not only does it crop in by quite a bit in order to get stabilization using the selfie cam, but it drops the frame rate to 30 FPS. It's still 1080p resolution, but dropping down to 30. Nevertheless, let me know your thoughts on the video as well as the audio quality when using the selfie cam.
So it's a bit of a bummer that steady face crops in so much and drops the frame rate, and it is a bit of a bummer that we're capped at 1080p resolution when using the selfie camera, but the images and the videos that we get at night actually come out better than I was expecting, even when taking portrait video at night. Now, selfie night on looks great, but even with beautify off makes me look a bit polished, especially with the flash on, and flash off with the portrait mode looks great. There's no night mode option here, but flash on really makes the subject pop. So while selfie videos on the X90 Pro are capped at 1080p and 60 FPS, and when you want stabilization, it drops that FPS count down to 30, which is a bit of a deal breaker if you ask me, the videos actually come out pretty good, and edge detection, even when taking cinematic video, looks great as well, that being portrait on Android devices, of course. And selfie photos actually come out a lot better than I was expecting in any lighting condition. Now, finally powering on the device and getting to that wonderful always on display. It's not quite as bright as I would have hoped for, but it's still there, which is great. And unfortunately, we don't have the 3D Sonic Max ultrasonic fingerprint sensor that we saw in last year's X80 Pro, though we do have 2D face unlock, not 3D face unlock. So it's not as secure, but it's nice and snappy like we've come to expect from all Vivo devices. And when it comes to the display, we do have a 6.78 inch AMOLED display. It is a tad bit downgraded from last year, which is strange. It is a 20:9 aspect ratio dual curved dot display. It has 1 billion colors thanks to it being 10-bit. It supports HDR10 plus content as well as Widevine L1 DRM. And while 1300 nits of peak brightness is more than acceptable, its predecessor had a higher peak brightness. But that's most likely because of the fact that it has a 2160Hz PWM dimming display, the highest I have ever seen on a phone to date. But another setback because of that PWM dimming is the fact that it sits at a 1260p resolution, which is pretty much somewhere between QHD and Full HD, with a PPI count of 453. Now, an even bigger knock because of that PWM dimming is the fact that it doesn't support an LTPO refresh rate, meaning that it's going to be fixed at either 60 or 120 Hz. Depending on which one you opt for, 120 Hz obviously being the most fluid, and we do have a 300 Hz touch sampling rate, which is actually the same that we saw last year. Now, moving on to the software side of things, we of course have that Funtouch OS 13 software skinned over Android 13. It's not quite as feature-packed as Origin OS that we see in the China models, but it supports native Google, which is great. We don't have large folders over here, which we've seen in the China models, but it's still nice and fluid, easy to use, and has all the widgets and app drawers and notifications that you've come to expect, know, and love from Vivo devices, as well as personalization menus, which is great. Haptics on this guy are up there with the best of the best in terms of flagship level haptics. Not to mention, we do have those wonderful dual stereo speakers, one at the bottom and one in the earpiece, but how do they sound when compared to some of the best sounding smartphones around? Now, when it comes to gaming, we do have the Ultra Game Mode overlay where you can use floating windows as well as game display enhancements. There is game frame interpolation where you can actually get higher frame rates, so it starts to skip frames, but it doesn't work as I would have hoped. So disable that to hit 60 FPS in Genshin Impact here. But we do have game boost mode, which boosts FPS, which is a good thing. And playing Genshin Impact, that being our first game here, it is capped at 60 FPS at the highest possible graphics and max FPS. The game is capped at 60. Even though the phone can hit 120, the game is capped at 60, and we're getting a rock solid average 60 FPS, which is even better than the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 phones I've recently tested. Now, when it comes to Call of Duty Mobile, low graphics to get that wonderful ultra FPS, we are reaching 90 FPS, and while the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 1 phones of the past can hit 90, not all of them do, so it's good to see Dimensity showing their thunder over here with Call of Duty Mobile. Not to mention, we're reaching 120 FPS in Real Racing 3 over here, which is great since almost every Snapdragon phone I've tested in the past year caps this game at 60. So reaching 120 on Real Racing 3 is definitely a plus, especially because of that wonderful new Dimensity chipset. Now, we do have 12 gigs of LPDDR5X RAM, and you can extend that by an additional 8 gigs, bringing it up to a total of 20 gigs of RAM, though that of course uses the onboard storage. And we have that wonderfully new MediaTek Dimensity 9200 octa-core CPU. And while it is stacked slightly different from the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chipset, it still uses the same cores, that being the Cortex X3 as the main, and it sits at a max clock speed of 3.05 gigahertz. And when pairing that up with the boost performance mode, thanks to the Ultra Game Mode, yielded an AnTuTu score of 1,264,337 points, which is really not far off, pretty much neck and neck with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. And when it comes to Geekbench testing out CPU over here, the single core score is quite a bit down from the 8 Gen 2, and the multi-core score is a lot down from it, but it still holds its own quite well. But when it comes to testing graphics in 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme, we got a very good score of 3752 with an average FPS of 22.5, which puts it above the average Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 powered smartphone I've tested on my channel. The new Dimensity 9200 chipset, which sits at the helm of the new Vivo X90 Pro, has actually impressed me more than I was expecting, and when paired up with the X90 Pro's improved V2 chip, larger cooling system, and faster RAM and storage, not only gives the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 CPU a run for its money, but sometimes even comes out on top in terms of gaming and benchmarks. It may lack a periscope sensor this time around and has a downgraded ultra-wide camera, but the improved telephoto and main cameras more than make up for it, especially since that 1-inch Sony IMX989 sensor takes some of the best photos I have ever seen. The X90 Pro also checks all the right boxes in terms of a new stunning vegan leather water-resistant design with a larger battery and extremely fast wired charging. Not to mention, it's also kitted with 50-watt wireless charging. Not to mention, we do have a much higher PWM rate this year, which is something that many people are going for. Probably the highest PWM rates I've ever seen in any smartphone to date. But of course, that comes with a bit of compromise, that being a slightly lower screen brightness, as well as LTPO tech, and a slightly lower resolution as well. But if you're one of those guys that are going for dimming features, this is most certainly the phone for you. Now, this might not be the biggest upgrade for those of you coming from the X80 Pro of last year, since that is still a fantastic phone, but this is probably the best upgrade you're going to get if you're coming from the previous generation, that being the X70 Pro lineup. And I couldn't recommend a better device for those coming from a previous generation Vivo device, because this is one of the best Vivo flagships that Vivo have ever released in the global market. Let me know your thoughts on the new X90 Pro in the comment section down below. This is TechNeck, and I'll catch you in the next one.